Hello, folks. Welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI 237. This is the Emperor's Vikings, the Varangian Guard. So, the Varangian Guard is a term we see used specifically for a contingent of Nordic soldiers in the Imperial Army from about the 1030s onwards. Their origins are most likely the mercenaries sent by Vladimir of Kiev to help out Basil II during the civil wars he fought against pretenders to the throne. Now, there is some evidence for small numbers of Russian mercenaries employed by Byzantium earlier in the 10th century, before Basil, but it's the connection between Basil and Vladimir that would have been the big influx. Basil seems to have been very fond of his Rus troops. After a battle in 1016, he's said to have given them a third of the spoils, which is quite a substantial portion of the plunder. Now, some historians have argued that the original Varangian Guard were the 6,000 troops that Vladimir sent, but there's no real evidence for a formal unit at that point. The Scandinavian mercenaries may have been in the service of the emperor from that point onwards, however. Clearly, they would have proven themselves to the imperial government as being an excellent resource, so why not continue the relationship? Now, a special unit within the imperial bodyguard is created from these Varangians around 1100. They're often called axe-wielding barbarians by our Greek sources to distinguish them from other troops, especially troops from other non-Byzantine peoples. What made them unusual is that, unlike many other groups of alien troops, they are not settled on specific land. They don't have the independence or the distractions that being bound to their own land caused. They were entirely dependent on the emperor's goodwill. They were also easily replaced by new recruits from Rus, so this made it easy to keep them in training and to keep them loyal. Now, as a note, after the Norman conquest in 1066, the composition of the Varangian Guard changed. The ranks were filled out by expatriate Anglo-Saxons. Some scholars think they actually dominated the group, others thought it was half and half. It's just an interesting example of how something that happened at the exact opposite end of Europe could have concrete consequences in the Byzantine Empire. Now, a few words now on the status of mercenaries hired by the Byzantines. They are called hetairoi, or companionships, and they are organized by great, middle, and minor, and each is led by a companionship lord. Mercenary groups employed by the emperor were organized by their place of origin, hence the Varangians. Although they were not given that name right away, we can presume they effectively existed from the time of Basil and Vladimir to the 14th century. Now, why were they an attractive proposition? Well, they were free of any allegiances within the Mediterranean world. There are many fewer complications to their service as a result. Service was also attractive to Scandinavians because it could be very lucrative. The Laxdale saga discusses Boli Boleson, who comes home in the 1030s after having been an officer in the Varangian Guard, and, quote, would wear no clothes but those made of scarlet and fur. He basically parades upon his return home with his equally splendid followers. Now, Anna Komnena, writing in the 12th century, says that the Varangians considered loyalty to the emperor to be a family tradition, handed down through the generations. Thus, they would never betray the emperor. But it is worth pointing out they're loyal to the throne, not the emperor. If the emperor died, they would swear allegiance to the next claimant. They would protect him from being killed, but they would not avenge his death. Now, the commander of the Varangians was called the Akoulithos, or the follower of the emperor, so the one who stands closest to the emperor on formal occasions, his chief bodyguard. The guard had its own barracks not far from the palace. They did take part in major conflicts elsewhere, but they were also involved in urban conflicts. They would suppress riots, for instance, at major sporting events, or arrest nobles or religious leaders who got into trouble with the emperor. We do have some archaeological remnants of the guard, specifically in the form of runic graffiti. So one is found on the marble railing of the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia. there are two pieces of runic graffiti there. One is not fully translatable, except that it's mentioned that there's a Halfdane. The second is a runic inscription carved on the Piraeus lion, which used to stand guarding the port of Athens until it was stolen by a Venetian admiral in the 17th century. It now stands in Venice outside the arsenal. Certainly, we have plenty of runic inscriptions from Scandinavia talking about men who went to serve the emperor in Miklagard, which means the great city, Constantinople. And when I say plenty, I mean around 30, which is plenty by runestone standards. Most of those referenced are called Grickfari or Greece farers. Now, the most famous member of the Varangian Guard is unquestionably Harald Hardrada, who was later the King of Norway. He was born in 1015. Now, when his older brother, King Olaf, was killed in 1030, Harald escaped and took up a wandering life. He had been wounded in the same battle, and he seems to have spent some time in Rus before he headed for Constantinople and took service in the Guard. So this comes back to what we were saying about Rus-Scandinavian contacts on Monday as well. So clearly it could work both ways. Scandinavians could take refuge in Rus, as well as vice versa, as with Vladimir. Now, it's interesting that the Guard is named as the Varangian Guard in our sources around the same time that Harald shows up. Positions in the Guard are much sought after because they were well paid and profitable. A Norseman could expect to return home a rich man, and Harald certainly made both his name and his fortune there in the 8 years that he served. Now, there is some debate as to how much of the Guard he actually commanded, possibly just the men he brought with him. One of the duties of the Guard at this point is to fight pirates in the eastern Mediterranean. So we see Greek, Arab, and Byzantine chroniclers all mentioning an Harald, who fought in Sicily, Bulgaria, Athens, Venice, and Africa. We are told that he sacked multiple towns in Sicily and Africa, usually by using trickery, and that he sent the treasure he got to Novgorod for safekeeping. The Guard also fought against the Norman invaders in southern Italy, who were threatening the Byzantine provinces there at the beginning of the 11th century. Now, he fought against the Bulgarians. Sorry, it should be beginning of the 12th century, not 11th century. He fought against the Bulgarians during the reign of Emperor Michael IV. He earned himself commendation, and he and his followers were given posts in the palace guard. They had actually taken service originally under Empress Zoe, who was the one with the actual royal blood. She had married Michael IV after possibly ridding herself of her previous husband, but when infighting erupted after his death, problems arose. Michael's heir was his nephew, Michael V, that Zoe was forced to adopt. He banished Zoe to a monastery, but she was the legitimate Macedonian heir, so it didn't take. The people of Constantinople weren't happy. Now, during this period of infighting, however, the Varangians had been deemed to be untrustworthy because they had supported Zoe, and they were sent off to be field soldiers again in the Near Eastern provinces, where Harald took on a command role. So we're told that he bathed in the Jordan when he was near Jerusalem, and that he donated money to churches, although he himself was only semi-Christian. When he was fighting near Jerusalem, he apparently was free from the regular chain of command, and he and his men arrived and pitched their tents in the best spot. When the Byzantine commander showed up, he ordered them to move. Harald said, "No, we answer only to the Empress," and both sides pulled out weapons. Harald proposed drawing lots, and the commander agreed, but said they had to be identical except for the marks that the two men would make on them. Now, Harald, we are told, asked to see the commander's mark to make sure he didn't duplicate it. But when the trustworthy referee drew the lot, Harald grabbed it and threw it into the water. The Greek said, "Hey, now, we won't know who won." But Harald said, "Just look at the remaining one. You'll see it's your mark. The one I threw away was mine." Yeah, his life is full of these stories. Now, when he came back to Constantinople, he was almost 30, and he decided it was time to go home. Zoe was not thrilled that he was planning to leave, and we're told that he fabricated an accusation to keep him there. Said that he had misapplied, she fabricated an accusation to keep him there. She said that he had misapplied the property of the emperor when he was on campaign. So, for instance, sending the treasure off to Novgorod. Also, that he had courted her niece without her permission. Now, despite what Snorri says, and this is Snorri that's telling us this story, it's unlikely that Zoe wanted to marry him herself. She was admittedly a bit crazy, but this is just puffery. Michael V, who was still trying to take control for himself, worsened this. He made a point of not trusting Harald publicly. He used the guard on an expedition, but not Harald himself. Finally had him imprisoned on charges of wrongly appropriating wealth. He was imprisoned with two of his Icelandic companions, one of whom was the ancestor of Snorri Sturluson. Hence, a fanciful version of Harald's story probably got passed down through the family. Harald is supposedly fished out of the deep dungeon by a mysterious lady who sends him and his companions out to safety. And the guard, which had sided with Zoe, had taken the city to facilitate their escape. And all supposedly this happens in one night. But they also blinded Michael V on their way out and collected their loot, according to Snorri. Really, it was Byzantine enemies who blinded the emperor. And just to top things off, we are told that they jumped the boats over the harbor chain and lost one of them, and took the empress's niece hostage briefly, then sent her ashore saying, "Don't try and keep me from going where I want," as a message to Zoe. Now, the reading I gave you, A Norwegian Soldier of Fortune in the East, is Snorri's version, and obviously has a number of the details confused. He obviously didn't really have an perfect view of Byzantine politics at the time. But when you take a look at it, ask yourself, is it still a historically useful document? All right, so what happens to the guard? The presence of the Varangians was often a sign of the emperor's presence on the battlefield. You always knew if you saw large, burly men carrying around long axes, apparently. But they did come to be a part of the regular army for a while as well. And we see them acting in both roles from the 11th to the early 13th century. So, for example, a large number of Varangians were killed defending the Emperor Romanos at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. We see them in 1081 at the Battle of Durazzo, and this is where Robert Guiscard, who was the Norman nemesis of the empire, besieged the city. Alexius Comnenus sent a large relief force with Varangian heavy infantry in the vanguard. Unfortunately, they managed to get surrounded by the Norman cavalry, a la the Battle of Hastings, and they're actually killed down to the last man. In 1088, supposedly a large number of Anglo-Saxons and Danes show up at Constantinople in a couple of hundred ships and immediately join up into imperial service, including in the Guard. We know that King Sigurd of Norway went on the Norwegian crusade to the Holy Land in the early 12th century, and then let most of his men join the Varangian Guard on the way back. In the Battle of Beroia in 1122, we know we're told they were Varangians that followed John Comnenus into battle against the Pechenegs, and the Pechenegs were horse archers from the steppe. The Byzantine troops had forced the Pechenegs back into their lager, which is the term for a wagon fort, but couldn't overrun them until the Varangians were sent in with their axes. They just hacked right through the wagons, but then instead of killing the Pechenegs, recruited them for the Byzantine army. Because, it worked really well for them, so why wouldn't the Pechenegs give it a try? 1167, the Battle of Sirmium, where Byzantium defeated Hungary. The Varangians were there as an imperial guard unit, a key part of the army. This army was not led by the emperor himself, but by his nephew Andronicus, who used the Varangians as part of the center of the army. Now, Alexius III, when he seized the throne in 1195, wrote the kings of Scandinavia asking for more men for the guard. Usually there were about 5,000 of them, but he expected trouble, so he wanted more. And in 1200, he used them to put down rebellions in the city. They marched on the palace at one point and decapitated a usurper emperor. Quite impressive, actually. Now, their low point was probably 1204 and the Fourth Crusade. So, this is where Constantinople was captured by the armies of the Fourth Crusade. The Varangians did their absolute best to try and fight off the Venetians scaling the walls, but they didn't manage it. They were disbanded as a permanent fighting force, and afterwards they served mostly as ceremonial or secondary guardsmen. Some of them went on to serve the emperors in exile at Nicaea, and the rulers of another Byzantine exile state at Epirus. They are stated as having guarded the emperor's treasury at Nicaea. We do see them being used as bodyguards and in ceremonies once the Byzantines finally retake the city in 1261, but they never take on the role they had before. In the late Byzantine period, we see them as prison guards. Apparently, they were pretty brutal. They were known for their skills at torturing people. So, how far are we going to fall here, guys? Now, in an amusing side note, they were apparently called the emperor's wineskins because they drank so much. So there was a certain amount of mockery for being foreign and uncouth, but still, for at least the bulk of their history, there was respect and even a little bit of fear because they were formidable warriors. So this is it's a bit of a footnote in terms of the Viking Age as a whole, but it's an interesting footnote, so I thought it was worth spending a little bit of time talking about it. All right, that should do it for this one. I will be back shortly.